Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of those stories that perfectly captures the energy of medieval Europe, where religion, pride, and barnyard animals somehow blended into political drama. So dim the lights, pull up that blanket and get cozy. Because tonight, we're drifting back to a time when dawn itself was a competitive sport, and the contestants were chickens. In the days before alarm clocks, church bells, or even reliable roosters that could mind their own business, medieval towns relied on sound. Bells rang for mass, monks chanted at intervals, and roosters, the poor feathered middle managers of daylight, were expected to perform with absolute precision. Now, to the modern mind, that sounds kind of charming. You picture a rustic village, misty fields, thatched roofs, and one noble rooster perched on a fence post announcing the sun. Very poetic. Except, multiply that by 20. Because every town, every manor, and sometimes every street had its own rooster. And medieval people, being medieval people, took this very seriously. There are recorded disputes, court cases, and even folk trials over roosters who allegedly crowed too early, too late, or worse, before a rival town's bird did. Yes, entire councils debated poultry punctuality. Let's float gently over to Flanders, around the late 13th century, a place famous for wool, beer, and civic pride so delicate it could be bruised by a chicken. The towns of Bruges and Ghent were already rivals. Their merchants fought over trade routes, their guilds competed in parades, and apparently even their animals got involved. According to one slightly dubious but deeply enjoyable Flemish chronicle, the rivalry extended to whose rooster greeted the sun first on feast days. Whichever bird crowed before dawn claimed divine favor for its town that day, meaning God, in his infinite wisdom, allegedly preferred Ghent over Bruges or vice versa. So naturally, both sides began interfering. There are accounts, half legend, half truth, of Ghent citizens sneaking into Bruges at night to confuse rival roosters by lighting torches in the darkness. The birds, thinking the sun had risen, crowed prematurely. By morning, the Bruges townsfolk would wake to humiliation. Their rooster had lied, and the day belonged to Ghent. You can imagine the theological spiral that followed. The priests were furious, the merchants mocked one another, and someone's poor bird probably ended up in a stew for dishonor. If that sounds like small-town nonsense, it was. But medieval Europe thrived on this kind of symbolic competition. Roosters weren't just alarm clocks, they were spiritual mascots. The cock, in Christian iconography, symbolized vigilance and the triumph of light over darkness. You know, the usual medieval anxiety package. So, whose rooster crowed first wasn't just local gossip. It was cosmic validation. In monastic life, especially in Benedictine communities, timing mattered more than food. The first sound of dawn meant matins, the night prayer, had ended successfully. If a nearby village's rooster crowed first, the monks took it as a subtle insult. Ah, they might mutter, God prefers their discipline to ours. Which is how we end up with stories of monks tampering with their own poultry, feeding them special grains, covering the coops to delay crowing, or even experimenting with candlelight cycles to retrain their sense of dawn. Yes, medieval monks accidentally invented rooster circadian manipulation. It's not recorded in detail, but you can imagine the trials. One abbot solemnly explaining to the scribe, Brother Matthew's rooster crows at 9:30, clearly a heretic. Over in rural France, things got even weirder. A small town in Burgundy, the records call it Saint-Remy-les-Oise, supposedly held an annual chant du coq competition every spring. Local farmers brought their best roosters to the market square, where the birds were placed on posts and waited for the sunrise. Whichever one crowed first was declared the coq du Seigneur, the Lord's rooster, for the year. The winning bird was pampered, paraded, and given a tiny wreath of herbs around its neck. The losing ones, well, let's just say the medieval concept of participation trophy involved a frying pan. The event wasn't just for fun, it was tied to ties. The owner of the winning rooster sometimes received a small tax exemption or a new patch of grazing land, as if divine timing had proved his virtue. There's even a 14th century poem mocking this practice, describing the vain men of Burgundy who worshipped their chickens more than their saints. The poet dryly adds, Their birds sing before the sun, yet the men sleep after mass. Subtle burn. But rooster feuds weren't limited to villages. Oh no, noble households got involved too, because medieval aristocrats could turn anything into a competition. In the early 1400s, Count Ludwig of Württemberg, a man of middling intelligence but impressive self-importance, supposedly had a prized rooster that always crowed first. He bragged about it to neighboring lords as if it were a knightly achievement. One visiting nobleman from Bavaria brought his own rooster along, just to prove Ludwig wrong. They held an impromptu crow duel in the castle courtyard at dawn. According to the chronicler, the Bavarian rooster crowed slightly earlier, prompting the count to accuse his rival of witchcraft. 2 days later, both birds disappeared. No one said anything, but the kitchen smelled suspiciously of stew that week. Because, really, no feud lasted long when hunger entered the chat. Let's glide gently to England now, the land of nothing better to do, especially between plagues. In several towns, notably Canterbury, Norwich, and Chester, rooster disputes occasionally reached local courts. These weren't criminal trials, of course, but property or nuisance cases. For example, in a 1379 municipal record, a man named Thomas of the Hill complained that his neighbor's rooster crowed at unholy hours before dawn, disturbing both prayer and rest. The court, rather than dismissing this as ridiculous, sent 2 officials to hear the bird. They literally stood outside at midnight waiting for the rooster to crow, which it did, loudly, and apparently with a sense of timing only chaos could love. The verdict? The owner was fined 1 penny for the disorder of his beast. Officially fined. For premature crowing. The same record mentions that Thomas's rooster, by contrast, was orderly and devout. Which, if nothing else, tells us medieval bureaucracy had a sense of humor. In coastal towns, roosters also played a part in maritime timing. Before standardized clocks, sailors used natural cues for navigation and daily rhythm. The crow of the rooster marked roughly the 3rd watch of the night, around 3 a.m., when crews changed duty. So, when rival ports like Bristol and Southampton argued about departure times, local pride sometimes boiled down to which town's sea rooster, yes, they had a title, crowed first on departure day. Imagine being a medieval dockworker and hearing your boss say, "We can't sail yet, Southampton's rooster hasn't spoken." The irony, of course, was that these birds were utterly inconsistent. Whether diet or a passing torch could make them crow at any hour. Yet men still debated them like divine instruments. One chronicler in 1421 dryly noted that the rooster of Bristol spake thrice before dawn, but the ships yet sat in port, for the wind obeyed no bird. There's your medieval management philosophy in one line. Sometimes, these avian arguments spiraled into full-blown superstition. People believed certain roosters had prophetic powers, especially those that crowed at improper hours. If a rooster crowed after sunset, it was thought to predict death, plague, or a surprise visit from tax collectors, which, frankly, were all the same thing. In 15th century Italy, towns occasionally held exorcisms for troublesome roosters. The priest would sprinkle holy water over the coop and command the bird to respect the hours of God. If it didn't, well, poultry stew again. It's honestly a wonder any chickens survived the Middle Ages at all. Now, one might wonder, how did this obsession even start? Partly, it's biblical. The rooster's crow famously marked Peter's denial of Christ, the moment of human weakness before redemption. So, the sound of the rooster became tied to repentance and new beginnings. But beyond theology, it was also about control. In a world without mechanical precision, timing meant morality. To be early was righteous. To be late was sinful. So when a bird crowed earlier than another, it became a symbol, not just of time, but of virtue. And since medieval people measured holiness in very practical terms, like bell ringing, candle burning, and chicken behavior, the line between divine order and barnyard chaos blurred easily. You could spend your life worrying about salvation, or you could worry about whether your rooster was embarrassing you before dawn. Most people did both. One especially delightful document survives from 1297 in a small monastery near Lyon. The abbot, clearly fed up, issued an edict forbidding contention among the brethren regarding the time of the cock. Apparently, several monks had been arguing for weeks about which rooster in the village had spoken most faithfully at dawn. The dispute became so heated that morning prayers were delayed. The abbot wrote, and this is a direct translation, "Let the hour of cockcrow be known only to God, and not to Brother Pierre." You can feel the exhaustion in that line. The rooster also crept into heraldry, those fancy family crests nobles loved to invent. For instance, the de Coke family of Brittany proudly bore a rooster on their shield, symbolizing faithful vigilance. But by the 15th century, neighboring nobles began teasing them for being braggarts of dawn. One mocking ballad went, "The cock of Coke crows first, yet none follow." Insults hit differently when written in Middle French poetry, but the gist remains. Even noble families turned the timing of rooster crowing into social ammunition. By the Renaissance, these absurdities began to fade, mostly because clocks arrived to ruin everyone's excuses. Once mechanical timekeeping spread, people stopped arguing about whose bird was holier. The rooster, poor thing, went from divine herald to rustic cliché. But in some remote areas, parts of Switzerland, rural Poland, and Brittany, competitions persisted into the 17th century. Travelers wrote amused notes about villages that still held crowing contests at Easter, where the winning bird was dressed in colored ribbons. The losers were eaten, and everyone politely pretended not to notice the symbolism. And yet, there's something almost sweet in it. This idea that entire towns once believed the universe cared about whose chicken yelled first. They found meaning in small things. They turned chaos into ritual. And even if it was absurd, it was consistent, which, in medieval life, was all you could really hope for. Because in a world without clocks, you trusted the rooster. And when that rooster betrayed you, you blamed the neighbor, the devil, or the rival monastery down the road. Either way, you had something to argue about over your morning ale. So as you drift off tonight, just imagine a misty medieval village, the quiet hum of dawn, a few scattered roosters testing their voices, and two half-asleep monks somewhere arguing over which one god preferred. And tomorrow, when your own alarm goes off too early, just be glad no one's taking you to Rooster Court. Chapter 2. The Monks Who Tried to Outcrow the Sun. In theory, monks were supposed to transcend worldly competition. You know, humble vows, quiet prayer, a little gardening, and a lot of Gregorian chanting. In practice, they were just humans in robes. And humans, regardless of haircut or century, will always find new ways to turn routine into rivalry. Among monastic communities, time was sacred, literally. The daily rhythm of worship, the liturgy of the hours, was divided by strict intervals. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. It sounds orderly now, but keeping that schedule in an age without clocks was a nightmare. Sunrise varied by the season. Clouds played tricks on the light. And in many monasteries, the first sign that the night was ending, the signal for the lauds bells, was, of course, the rooster's crow. Simple enough. Until someone's rooster started crowing earlier than everyone else's. Records from Cluny Abbey, that sprawling powerhouse of medieval monasticism, mention disputes about the crow of the yard. Apparently, one particularly punctual rooster, described as a bird of excessive zeal, caused such confusion that several monks began rising before dawn just to match it. Before long, the abbey's schedule was a disaster. Matins blurred into lauds, the kitchen fires were lit too early, and exhausted novices were falling asleep during psalms. The abbot had to intervene, declaring that no cock shall rule the hours, but the rule of Saint Benedict only. Which sounds impressive, until you realize someone had to write that sentence down officially because a chicken had taken over timekeeping duties. The obsession wasn't unique to Cluny. At Monte Cassino, the Italian mother house of Benedictine order, there are letters from the 12th century complaining about unnatural birds. One monk accused another of secretly feeding his rooster a mixture of wine and garlic to make it more spirited at dawn. The accused, Brother Guido, denied it, claiming divine inspiration. The abbot was unconvinced. The rooster was confiscated and sent to the kitchens for penitence. That's medieval code for, we ate the evidence. It wasn't entirely superstition, there was some logic buried in the madness. Roosters are sensitive to light, temperature, and moon cycles. They don't actually wait for the sun to rise. They predict it based on their internal rhythm. So, if one monastery's rooster crowed half an hour earlier, it might mean their yard was on higher ground, or caught the first glint of morning. But medieval logic didn't work like that. To them, an early crow wasn't meteorology, it was morality. An eager rooster meant a holy community. A late rooster suggested spiritual laziness. Hence, the increasingly bizarre attempts by monks to train their birds. At a small priory near Cologne, chroniclers noted a series of night experiments by the brothers to manipulate their rooster's sense of dawn. They tried controlling how much light reached the coop. They even built a kind of wooden hutch clock with tiny windows to let in gradual sunlight, hoping to engineer the perfect moment of crowing. It failed, obviously. The rooster just stopped crowing altogether for 3 days, which they interpreted as a divine sign, or possibly the bird's personal protest. When it finally resumed, the abbot gave a sermon titled, "The Pride of Birds and the Humility of Men." Translation: we lost control of our chicken again, and it's God's fault now. Meanwhile, Cistercian monks, those famous rivals of the Benedictines, prided themselves on simplicity. No fancy robes, no gold chalices, and certainly no rooster rivalries. Except they absolutely had rooster rivalries. The Abbey of Clairvaux, founded by Saint Bernard, kept a small poultry yard for eggs and meat. According to a local chronicle, Brother Gerd, who oversaw the coop, became convinced that one of his birds could predict storms. When the rooster crowed at odd hours, Gerd took it as a divine weather alert. He started interrupting work hours to warn the community. Eventually, the abbot had to forbid him from announcing holy meteorology. In response, Gerard allegedly muttered, "If the Lord speaks through the beast, who am I to silence him?" Classic monk energy, passive-aggressive obedience. Over time, the problem expanded beyond mere schedule confusion. Roosters became theological metaphors, whether monks wanted them to or not. A rooster crowing before dawn was like the soul yearning for redemption before grace. A silent rooster symbolized spiritual sloth. One that crowed repeatedly during the night? Clearly demonic temptation. You can imagine the debates. A group of bleary-eyed friars, half asleep, arguing in Latin about whether Brother A's rooster had succumbed to sin. There are entire sermons preserved in dusty archives comparing the human heart to a chicken coop, which is as flattering as it sounds. One particularly long-winded monk from York, known to history only as Frater Osbertus, wrote a treatise called De Cantagallorum on the Song of Roosters. He spent 30 pages analyzing why God might have chosen a rooster to signal Peter's repentance. His conclusion? Because roosters speak without thought, yet command attention. Basically, divine creatures with no filter. It's hard not to imagine Osbertus staring out his window at some squawking bird and thinking, "Ah yes, theology." Sometimes, the monks took it even further, into ritual. At certain abbeys in northern France, there was an unofficial tradition on the feast of St. Peter. A ceremonial rooster would be carried through the cloister at dawn. The monks would process behind it, chanting psalms about repentance and renewal. The bird, bewildered, was then blessed with holy water and returned to its coop. One year, a nervous novice dropped the rooster halfway through the ceremony, and it ran shrieking into the refectory. The chronicler calmly notes that several brothers took this as an omen of coming scandal. They were right, apparently. The abbot resigned the next year. Coincidence? Probably. But in the medieval mind, cause and effect were just close enough to be poetic. Even outside monasteries, priests got in on the act. In parish churches, the rooster became a symbol atop weather vanes, the church cockerel you still see today. It wasn't just decorative, it reminded the congregation of vigilance and repentance. But locals, being locals, soon began treating the church rooster as a kind of civic champion. If the wind made it spin toward the rising sun first, they'd say their parish had God's blessing that day. If it pointed west, toward the rival village, bad omen. You can guess how many petty arguments that caused. In one recorded case from 1440, two parishes in Picardy accused each other of witchcraft of the vane. Each claimed the other had greased their rooster statue with oil so it would spin unnaturally. The bishop had to issue a decree forbidding mechanical interference with the sign of dawn. So yes, medieval France had literal anti-weather vane legislation. Meanwhile, in the quieter corners of England, some monks simply gave up on all of it. A letter from a frustrated prior at Ely Abbey in the 1300s reads, "Henceforth, the bell shall ring by the hand of man, not by the throat of any bird." It's hard to blame him. If your salvation depended on the punctuality of a half-asleep rooster, you'd probably invent clocks, too. Still, not all monks were exasperated. Some grew strangely fond of their birds. Roosters became quasi-pets, small sources of companionship in an otherwise silent life. They followed the brothers around the garden, ate scraps from the table, and were occasionally mentioned by name in account books. One Benedictine inventory lists Brother Peter's cock, red and faithful, alongside the bread rations. Another entry, from 1382, mournfully notes, "The abbot's bird has gone to rest. The kitchen received it with gratitude." It's touching in a mildly tragic, culinary way. Let's glide gently over to the Franciscans, who, being less cloistered, had a more relaxed approach to rooster drama. They often used the bird in sermons as a moral example. Friars traveling through Italy and France would tell villagers that the rooster announces hope, and that those who wake before dawn to pray are like the bird, faithful, noisy, and slightly irritating. One friar even composed a parody hymn that began, "O Gallus, custos Lucas, O rooster, keeper of the light." He was reprimanded for irreverence, but the tune apparently became popular with children, which is possibly how early Christian folk music began, bedtime songs about poultry and sin. Through all this, it's easy to forget how simple the original problem was. People wanted to know what time it was. But without clocks, they turned to the creatures that seemed to know. And because humans can't help assigning meaning to noise, the rooster became not just a bird, but a teacher, a judge, and occasionally, a scapegoat. It was never really about dawn. It was about control, that fragile medieval hope that someone, or something, knew when to begin the day. Even if that someone was a feathery idiot standing on a fence. If you close your eyes, you can almost picture them, monks in woolen robes, stumbling through the cloister in dim candlelight, muttering half prayers, half complaints, while somewhere outside, a rooster miscalculates sunrise again. And you can imagine the abbot sighing, thinking, "Ah, God's will, and poultry management." The bells would ring, the prayers would start, and the entire divine machinery of the monastery would grind on, powered, somehow, by one slightly confused chicken. Chapter 3. The Noble Houses That Dueled Over Dawn. By the time you reached the late Middle Ages, roosters had moved from barnyards to courtrooms, and from breakfast tables to heraldry. Because naturally, if peasants and monks were already arguing over whose bird was holier, the nobility couldn't just sit quietly and let commoners monopolize poultry prestige. Oh no, they made it fashionable. Among medieval elites, everything was a symbol, your sword, your seal, even your hat feathers. And the rooster, once just an early alarm with feathers, became a statement of divine right, masculine virtue, and occasionally unbearable vanity. If the rooster crowed first, it meant you were closer to God, you were more disciplined, and you probably had the best breakfast wine in the duchy. Which brings us to one of history's most unnecessary rivalries, the Dawn feud of Bavaria, circa 1432. Two noble families, the von Reiters and the Hohenbachs, owned neighboring estates near Augsburg. They already disliked each other for all the classic reasons: land boundaries, taxes, and someone allegedly seducing someone's cousin at a tournament. But things escalated when the von Reiters began bragging that their manor's rooster, a glossy red brute named Kaiser, crowed earlier than the Hohenbach's rooster every morning. A servant even claimed he timed it by 2 Ave Marias earlier. That was the 15th century equivalent of owning the faster Wi-Fi. Naturally, the Hohenbach patriarch, Lord Dietrich, refused to let this insult stand. He accused the Reiters of keeping their rooster awake with torches to trigger an early crow. The insult grew until both families sent formal complaints to the Stadtrat, the city council. That's right, Augsburg city officials had to mediate a rooster-based feud between nobles. The minutes of the council meeting, partially preserved, describe it as a matter of honor concerning the Order of Dawn. You can almost hear the clerk sighing as he wrote that. The ruling was diplomatic. Both roosters were to be locked in identical coops, observed by neutral parties, and released at the same moment before sunrise. And yes, this test actually happened. On the chosen morning, half the town gathered. A priest blessed the contest. Someone even brought pastries. The birds were unveiled. They stared at each other, and neither crowed. Apparently, both were too startled by the crowd. The silence stretched on until, according to one chronicler, the Hohenbach cook sneezed, and the writer bird, mistaking it for thunder, gave a solitary crow. The writers declared victory on the spot. The Hohenbachs demanded a rematch. The council banned all further cock duels, and that was that, though rumor says the families continued to whisper about it for decades. Imagine holding a grudge because your chicken panicked first. Across Europe, similar scenes played out, less formal but equally ridiculous. In France, the aristocratic de Roqueforts hosted annual dawn feasts in which guests would bet on which rooster would crow first. It became a sort of party game. The winner received a jeweled cup, the chalice of light. The losing bird was, predictably, retired with honor, meaning it became soup. One particularly eccentric duke even tried to commission a painting of his rooster crowing victoriously at dawn. The artist, confused, produced a rather gloomy portrait of a bird on a windowsill, surrounded by clouds. The duke loved it anyway. It hung in his great hall under the inscription, Prima vox lucis mea estate, the first voice of light is mine. That same duke later tried to patent his rooster's lineage, insisting it was descended from a holy cock of Saint Benedict. No one believed him, but everyone nodded politely. That's aristocracy for you. Further south, in Italy, things got more theatrical. The Renaissance nobles of Florence adored symbolic pageantry. If a rooster could represent virtue, then why not stage a festival around it? And so emerged the Festa del Gallo d'Oro, Festival of the Golden Rooster. It began, allegedly, with a dispute between two Florentine merchants who shared a boundary wall. One claimed his rooster's crow had woken the neighborhood first, the other insisted his bird had. Rather than duel, which was technically illegal that week, they agreed to let the birds settle it in public. The spectacle drew a crowd. Someone added musicians. A baker sold rooster-shaped pastries. And soon, the whole thing became a civic event. By the 1490s, the Florentine City Council was officially funding the festival. Competitors dressed their roosters in tiny ribbons of their family colors, and local judges declared the winner Herald of Dawn. The title carried no real prize, just bragging rights and a suspiciously high rate of stew-based disappearances. Over in England, rooster rivalry took on a more gentlemanly tone, which is to say, passive-aggressive and absurdly bureaucratic. Noble estates kept rooster registers, small notebooks tracking the daily crow times of their prized birds. These records were treated with the same seriousness as hunting logs. Lord Henry Talbot, for example, kept one such ledger in 1468. He noted that his rooster, named Constant, crowed precisely 1 bell before dawn for 38 consecutive days. He even recorded deviations. On the 17th day, Constant failed to crow. The morning was fogged. Displeasing. Reading through the entries, you can feel the slow creep of obsession. It's like medieval Fitbit tracking, but for poultry. Of course, not every noble family managed to keep it so civilized. In Castile, around 1502, the House of Mendoza and the House of Guzman were entangled in what Spanish historians dryly call La Disputa del Gallo. Apparently, one rooster had been gifted by a royal courtier to the Mendozas, a rare breed known for its dark plumage and strong voice. The Guzmans claimed the gift had been meant for them instead. Insults flew. Threats were exchanged. By the time King Ferdinand heard about it, men were actually dueling with swords for the honor of the rooster. The king, unimpressed, issued a decree forbidding the employment of weapons in disputes of dawn or fowl. The rooster itself? It was quietly confiscated and kept in the royal aviary, where, according to rumor, it never crowed again. Perhaps even it was embarrassed. Meanwhile, in the courts of Burgundy, rooster contests took a philosophical turn. The Duke scholars debated whether a rooster's crow truly marked the sun's rise, or if the bird's call caused it. It sounds ridiculous, but in an age when astrology blended with theology, the question mattered. Was the rooster a herald of nature, or a partner in creation? One scholar boldly argued that the bird commands the light, a theory that won him a generous stipend and the lasting ridicule of everyone else. Still, he published a treatise called De Potestate Gallorum Super Oraram on the power of roosters over the dawn. He was apparently serious. It sold well among the Duke's friends, who probably bought it for the same reason people today buy novelty calendars. The Habsburgs, predictably, took things too far. In Vienna, around 1520, Emperor Maximilian I ordered the construction of an elaborate mechanical clock featuring, you guessed it, a golden rooster that crowed on the hour. The machine was supposed to symbolize divine order, but it malfunctioned constantly. Sometimes it crowed at random intervals during Mass, startling the congregation. Sometimes it refused to stop crowing, echoing through the cathedral for minutes on end. A Spanish ambassador wrote that the emperor's rooster mocks the Lord himself, for it crows even in darkness. The clockmaker was not executed, just relocated to quieter employment. Still, the symbolism stuck. From that point onward, the imperial rooster became an emblem of both pride and embarrassment, much like the dynasty itself. Roosters even crept into royal marriages. When noble houses united through arranged unions, their heraldic animals often got merged: lions, eagles, dragons, all the standard medieval zoo. But on one memorable occasion in Navarre, a rooster and a serpent were combined into a single emblem. The official description called it a cock of wisdom. Unofficially, everyone agreed it looked like a confused worm with feathers. The marriage didn't last, predictably. The wife returned to her family, taking the rooster design with her, and the crest was quietly retired for lack of dignity. Even in quieter corners of Europe, pride over rooster timing persisted. In a small duchy in Lorraine, nobles once held a banquet called the Breakfast of Triumph, celebrating the day their manor rooster crowed before the neighboring abbey's bird. Guests toasted the rooster's noble punctuality with wine at 5 a.m. The chronicler, clearly unimpressed, ended his account with, "They dined as men who have defeated the sun." There's something endearingly feudal about that image. A table of half-drunk lords celebrating the microscopic victory of being slightly earlier than nature. As the centuries drifted on, these rooster rivalries became quaint legends, small curiosities in local folklore. Children's tales turned proud nobles into comedic figures: the duke who fought the dawn, the baron's boastful bird, and the knight of the early crow. Each story carried the same moral: pride crows first, wisdom sleeps in, which, to be fair, is still solid advice. So by the end of the medieval period, Europe's ruling classes had officially turned the rooster, a humble barnyard creature, into a symbol of time, pride, and status anxiety. It crowed for God, for family, and for the fragile human need to be first, even at something utterly meaningless. And maybe that's why the rooster fits so perfectly into the medieval psyche. It doesn't care who's listening or what it's competing with. It just announces itself, loudly, pointlessly, but with total conviction. A perfect mirror for nobility. Somewhere, in a drafty castle, a sleepy servant once wrote in the margins of his lord's record book, "The rooster crowed again." His lordship smiled. "I suppose that means we win." And that's the entire medieval era, summarized in one line. Chapter 4: The Crowing Wars of Burgundy. By the time we wander into the late 14th century, the rooster problem had officially graduated from quirky village issue to full-blown regional obsession. Burgundy, being Burgundy, decided to make it art. This was a place that turned winemaking into religion and embroidery into diplomacy, so naturally, their roosters had to be better than everyone else's. The town of Beaune, which already fancied itself the jewel of the duchy, claimed their rooster, a particularly haughty bird named Charles, after their duke, was not only the loudest but also the most punctual in Christendom. They swore by it. Charles the rooster was, according to legend, so dedicated that he once crowed in the middle of a thunderstorm just to prove that nature itself couldn't delay him. Of course, that might have just been thunder, but details never stopped Burgundian pride. Next door, in Chalon-sur-Saône, the townspeople took offense. Not at the rooster per se, but at the idea that anyone could claim to have the more punctual bird. So they held an official contest, because apparently human civilization had run out of real problems. The contest was elaborate. Both towns brought their most esteemed roosters, along with a priest, a judge, and 2 record keepers. The rules were simple. The first rooster to crow at dawn would bring glory to its town. The loser's owner had to pay a fine, usually a symbolic sum, like a sack of barley or a cask of wine, and, more humiliatingly, agree that their bird was lazy. This was, of course, a fate worse than death in Burgundy. The contest began at dusk, with both birds being placed on their respective perches inside identical coops. Villagers gathered. The priest prayed for divine impartiality. And as the night dragged on, the air thickened with tension, which is a polite way of saying that everyone was half drunk and whispering insults at the opposing chicken. Then came dawn. Bones' rooster, Noble Charles, lifted his head. The crowd leaned in. And then, for reasons known only to the chaotic gods of poultry, he decided to yawn instead. His rival from Chalon, a rather shabby but spirited rooster named Pierre, crowed almost immediately. The crowd erupted. Chalon had won. And if this were any normal town, the story would end there. But no. Bones' delegation demanded a recount. They claimed Pierre had crowed too early, technically before dawn, which in rooster law apparently counted as cheating. The priest, torn between divine duty and local politics, ruled that dawn was whenever God intended it to be, which helped no one. The record keepers disagreed on the exact moment of sunrise, since neither of them owned a clock. And so the 2 towns declared the contest inconclusive. But that didn't stop them from bragging about it for the next century. In the years that followed, both Beaune and Chalon began hosting crowing festivals. These were part fair, part civic therapy, and mostly an excuse to drink wine before breakfast. Villages would bring their roosters, judges would argue about timing, and someone would inevitably declare the event cursed. At one point, Burgundy's Duke Philip the Good even received a formal petition from several wine-growing parishes asking him to establish an official rooster standard, a kind of metric system for crowing. The Duke's reply was short: "I have wars to fight. Let the birds decide." Which, honestly, was the only sensible sentence in the whole affair. Still, the Burgundians couldn't help themselves. They began painting roosters on their banners, coins, and even church windows. It became a symbol of civic pride, or possibly civic delusion, depending on who you asked. To them, the rooster wasn't just a bird. It was proof that Burgundy rose before France. And in a way, they weren't entirely wrong, because the rooster was already a French symbol long before it became a national one. Medieval chroniclers had associated it with vigilance and faith, 2 qualities that France claimed in theory, if not always in practice. The Burgundians just took that idea and made it local. Their rooster didn't just announce the dawn, it announced identity. But, as with all things medieval and prideful, it didn't stay cute forever. By the mid-15th century, the crowing wars had escalated to include accusations of sabotage. One town accused another of feeding their rooster fermented grapes to make it crow prematurely. Another claimed its champion bird had been bewitched after mysteriously losing its voice right before the contest. That incident led to an actual trial, not for the bird, but for the supposed witch. She was acquitted, but only after promising to stay at least 10 leagues away from poultry. The chroniclers record this as if it were all very solemn and legal. But you can almost hear the sighs between the lines. Somewhere, a clerk had to sit there and write, "Subject: alleged magical interference with rooster." It's the kind of bureaucracy that makes you wonder how Europe ever survived the Black Death. Eventually, the obsession cooled. Wars came and went. Burgundy fell to France. The roosters, mercifully, went back to being breakfast alarms instead of international diplomats. But the idea of competing dawns lingered. Even centuries later, local proverbs survived. Phrases like, "He crows like bones, fool," or "Chalin's sun waits for no bird." And beneath all the absurdity, there's a quiet truth. These towns weren't really fighting about roosters. They were fighting about pride, time, and the desperate medieval need to matter. To be first at something, even if that something was a chicken screaming at the sky. Let's float onward to another episode of medieval poultry pride, one that got even weirder because it involved actual lawsuits, bribes, and a bishop who decided to weigh in personally. Because of course he did. Chapter 5. The Bishop, the Bribes, and the Crow That Never Slept. So by the 15th century, rooster politics had reached what we could generously call peak absurdity. It had stopped being a rural pastime and started creeping into actual governance. Priests were involved. Notaries were involved. And in one memorable case, a bishop got dragged into what might be the most bureaucratically overcomplicated poultry scandal in recorded history. It happened in a small but ambitious town just outside of Rouen, a place that prided itself on two things: its cathedral bells and its roosters. The bells rang late. The roosters crowed early. The people thought that was balance. But apparently, it was too much for their neighbors, who were sick of being accused of waking up second. The issue began innocently enough, as all medieval disasters do. The prior of the local monastery had a favorite rooster named Guillaume. Guillaume wasn't remarkable in looks: patchy feathers, one slightly crossed eye, a comb that looked like it had been chewed, but he had a gift. Every morning, almost to the second, he crowed at first light. The monks, who had long struggled to wake up for matins, adored him. Guillaume was, in effect, the monastery's unpaid alarm clock. Word spread. Farmers started timing their chores by him. Local merchants claimed they opened shop when Guillaume says so. And in a time when even the concept of time was flexible, this chicken had become the closest thing to reliable, which naturally made everyone furious. The neighboring village accused the monks of training the bird with artificial light, an outrageous claim, given that medieval illumination was about as bright as a dying candle. But they insisted Guillaume's punctuality was suspiciously divine. And since anything suspiciously divine usually meant possibly demonic, a local inquiry was opened. Enter the Bishop of Rouen, a man named Hugues de Mainville. Hugues was the kind of churchman who genuinely enjoyed procedure. He saw canon law the way a cat sees string, endlessly fascinating. When he got wind that two parishes were at war over a rooster, he didn't sigh and ignore it. He sent a summons. The monks, thinking this would all be cleared up in a day, brought Guillaume with them to the episcopal court, which, yes, meant an actual courtroom scene with a rooster sitting in the middle like some feathery defendant. The bishop began by asking whether the bird had ever displayed unnatural behavior. One monk admitted that Guillaume sometimes crowed during the night. That, of course, was all anyone needed to hear. Hugues frowned. During the night? He repeated, like the phrase itself was sinful. And what, pray, inspires him to cry out in darkness? The monk, not realizing this was a trap, said cheerfully, "Oh, perhaps he dreams, my lord." And that was the end of it. The bishop declared that Guillaume should be confined for observation, which is an ecclesiastical way of saying they put the poor bird in a box for 3 nights to see if he crowed spontaneously. He did. Every time. Usually around midnight, which, to be fair, is technically morning somewhere. Now, this is where things take a turn from ridiculous to operatically ridiculous. While Guillaume was under watch, the rival town saw an opportunity. They bribed one of the bishop's clerks to slip an extra clause into the report, implying the monks may have invoked certain charms to alter the bird's behavior. The bishop, being more devoted to paperwork than poultry, read it aloud without question and declared an inquiry into possible sorcery. A witch trial for a rooster. The monks were horrified. They swore oaths, produced witnesses, even brought in a theologian who argued that a rooster's nocturnal crowing is but the echo of its zeal for dawn. Which, honestly, deserves an award for the most poetic nonsense ever submitted to a court. The bishop, unmoved, announced a compromise. Guillaume would not be executed, a small mercy, but he would be purified. This involved sprinkling him with holy water, reciting a psalm, and then tying a small wooden cross to his leg, which naturally he hated. The chronicles say that when they released him afterward, he ran straight into the cloister garden and refused to crow for 3 days. The monks called it a miracle. The townsfolk called it guilt. But the story doesn't end there. A few weeks later, the bishop received a sealed letter. No sender, just a wax crest stamped with a rooster. Inside was a simple note. The bird has returned to his ways. He crows even when the moon is high. The bishop, sighing deeply, sent another summons. But this time, the monks didn't show up. When his men arrived, they found the coop empty. Guillaume was gone. The monks claimed he'd flown away, though given that the monastery's walls were 20 feet high, it's more likely he became dinner. The case was left unresolved. The bishop closed it with the driest possible verdict. Matter concluded by divine disappearance. And yet, despite all that, Guillaume became a legend. Villagers said that sometimes, on misty nights, you could still hear him crow, a restless ghost rooster calling the hour that didn't exist. In truth, it was probably just another chicken. But the tale spread, embroidered and retold, until the crow that never slept became shorthand for any town that couldn't stop competing. Because really, that's what all these stories were about. The endless medieval need to prove one's village was slightly holier, cleaner, or louder than the next. You'd think people had better things to do. But when your biggest entertainment options are church or plague, I suppose rooster drama feels like a step up. Let's drift onward, then, to another tale, this one involving not just a rooster, but a town that turned crowing into politics and somehow managed to make it even less dignified than it already was. Because yes, it's time for the mayor of St. Lo and his chicken-shaped scandal. Chapter 6, The Mayor's Chicken and the Civic Crisis of St. Lo. By the time we reached the 16th century, rooster rivalry had gone from parish gossip to small-town politics. And nowhere did this absurd evolution play out more dramatically than in the Norman town of St. Lo, a place that seemed perpetually torn between civic pride and mild embarrassment. St. Lo's rooster wasn't famous for punctuality or beauty or any of the usual avian virtues. It was famous because it wouldn't shut up. It crowed all the time, dawn, noon, twilight, sometimes in the middle of sermons. It had an astonishing lung capacity and a total lack of shame. Its owner, a local baker named Etienne, adored it. The neighbors did not. At first, people laughed. Then, as happens with all things medieval, they stopped laughing and started suing. Complaints poured in. The rooster disturbed sleep, frightened children, and interrupted prayerful meditation. Etienne ignored them. He said the bird was a blessing, the voice of the town's industrious spirit. And that's how the mayor got involved. The mayor of St. Lo at the time was Guillaume Lefebvre, a man so cautious that his nickname was Le Parchemin, the parchment, because he preferred paperwork to people. Guillaume despised chaos, and a rooster that crowed at the wrong time of day was, to him, civic anarchy. So he did what bureaucrats do best. He formed a committee. The Commission on Civic Noise and Moral Order, yes, that was the actual title, held hearings in the town hall. Witnesses testified about the rooster's offenses. One woman claimed it crowed exactly 13 times each morning, which she said was proof of witchcraft. Another insisted it crowed louder during Lent, which must have meant the devil was tuning it. The baker defended his bird with almost religious zeal. He said it crowed in the language of honest labor. That phrase alone was enough to split the town. Half thought it profound, the other half thought Etienne had lost his mind. When the council couldn't decide, they sent the issue to the bishop. The bishop, clearly tired of rooster cases by this point in history, wrote back, "I see no sin in a creature that announces daylight." That should have been the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. The mayor, humiliated that the church had overruled him, declared the rooster a public matter and seized it. The guards showed up at Etienne's bakery one foggy morning and carted the bewildered bird off to the town jail, a stone cell that usually housed drunks and stolen goats. This might sound ridiculous, But remember, we're talking about a world where animals could be legally tried. So yes, the rooster got an actual trial. The proceedings were recorded, astonishingly, in the town archives, which means someone, somewhere, had to write the following line. Today, the accused fowl was presented before the council. The charges were as follows: disturbing the peace, defying the natural order of day and night, sowing discord among honest townsfolk. To all of which Etienne, speaking for his bird, pled not guilty. The court appointed a notary to transcribe the case. Witnesses argued over what qualified as excessive crowing. One claimed the rooster crowed as early as 2 in the morning. Another swore it crowed whenever Etienne's oven door opened, as if baking triggered it. The mayor sighed loudly at least 6 times. In the end, the rooster was found culpable of disorderly behavior. It wasn't executed, public relations being what they were, but it was exiled. Specifically, it was banished beyond the limits of St. Louis gates for no less than 1 year and 1 day. Etienne was furious. He packed up his bakery and moved to a nearby hamlet, taking his rooster with him. You'd think the story would end there, with a slightly quieter town and one triumphant baker shaking his fist at the skyline. But fate, as usual, had other plans. Because once the rooster was gone, the town fell oddly silent. Too silent. The mornings felt empty. The bells sounded late. People overslept. The markets opened sluggishly. Within a month, half the merchants were complaining that business was down because, quote, the town no longer knows when morning is. Apparently, no one had considered that the bird had been the unofficial clock. Realizing this, the council quietly wrote to Etienne, offering a small stipend if he would permit his avian to return for the good of civic morale. Etienne refused, unless the mayor himself apologized. And so, one mild autumn morning, the mayor of St. Lo rode out with 2 councilmen and a bottle of wine to the hamlet of Ponebert, where Etienne now lived. They found him outside his bakery, the rooster perched proudly on a barrel. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next, but one witness wrote that the mayor, in full regalia, bowed slightly to the bird and said, St. Lo would like to wake up again. Etienne smirked. The rooster crowed. Deal done. The prodigal bird returned to St. Lo in a small procession. Children threw petals. Someone played a lute. The town declared it a symbol of renewal. The mayor issued an official decree calling the rooster a friend of labor and herald of peace, which, frankly, was a dramatic turnaround from disturber of the natural order. From then on, the rooster was treated like a civic mascot. It was fed daily scraps from the bakery and granted free range of the marketplace. There's even a note from a visiting merchant in 1521 describing how the townspeople bow their heads slightly when it cries, as if to greet the sun with humility. Etienne eventually died, peacefully, one assumes, and the rooster followed soon after. It was buried behind the bakery, and because medieval people never missed a chance for ritual, the town priest said a small prayer over the grave. After that, St. Lo adopted a new motto for its town seal, Semper Vigilans, always watchful. And yes, it featured a rooster. You'd think that would have been enough to close the book on medieval rooster drama. But no, the story of St. Lo inspired copycats all over France. Towns started naming their roosters after saints, giving them miniature crowns, even hosting crowing days with prizes for the earliest call. For a brief, bewildering moment, roosters were civic heroes. And then, as with all trends, everyone lost interest. The next century would bring more pressing issues: war, reformations, taxes, things that even the loudest rooster couldn't shout down. Still, somewhere in Normandy, the descendants of that noisy bird probably went on crowing through the generations, oblivious to the fact that one of their ancestors had once been exiled and reinstated by official decree. And it does make you wonder, when the mayor bowed to that rooster, who really ruled the town? Let's drift, now, a little farther south, to a place where rooster pride collided with royal politics, and the result was so strange it made the chroniclers laugh in the margins. Because in the court of Louis XII, someone decided to appoint a royal chicken keeper. Chapter 7: The King's Rooster and the Rise of the Royal Henhouse. By the dawn of the 16th century, France had entered what historians like to call its sensible phase. Wars were fewer, fashions were cleaner, and at least one king brushed his teeth. Unfortunately, this phase was short-lived, and in its place came Louis XII, a monarch whose court managed to turn farm animals into political metaphors. Louis, to be fair, wasn't a bad king. He was mild, bookish, and perpetually tired. His nickname was Father of the People, which sounds wholesome until you realize it probably came from how often he sighed at meetings. He married well, fought reluctantly, and had a fondness for quiet gardens and domestic peace, which made it all the stranger when he suddenly developed a fascination with roosters. It started, as these things often did, with a gift. One spring morning in 1507, a nobleman from Brittany presented the king with a particularly striking bird, tall, snow-white, with a comb like a crimson crown. The nobleman, who was clearly trying to curry favor, claimed the bird's dawn call could be heard clear across the Loire. Louis, charmed by the idea of an animal that announced the sun before his courtiers announced complaints, decided to keep it. He named it Charlemagne, and that might have been the end of it had the rooster not become something of a celebrity. Charlemagne the rooster lived in a gilded cage near the royal gardens. Each morning, a servant opened the shutters so the bird could perform his royal duty. Courtiers claimed the king timed his morning prayers to the crowing, a story that was probably exaggerated but believable given how medieval monarchs loved routines that sounded pious. Soon, the bird had his own attendants. One groom to feed him, another to clean the cage, a third to make sure no other rooster crowed earlier. The palace staff joked that Charlemagne had better living conditions than the royal astrologer. Things escalated when a visiting ambassador from Venice, attempting to flatter the king, remarked that the rooster was a symbol of vigilance and virtue, much like His Majesty. That was all the justification Louis needed to turn a random farm bird into a national emblem. Overnight, the rooster became official royal imagery. The king had it embroidered onto tapestries, etched into silver, and painted on the ceilings of guest chambers. Someone even commissioned a miniature portrait of Charlemagne in profile, regal stance, glinting eye, and all. One of the court poets, desperate for attention, wrote a sonnet titled, "To the Bird Who Heralds France." The first line was apparently, "Where others sleep, thou crowest truth to power," which, frankly, is a lot of pressure to put on a chicken. Now, not everyone at court was thrilled about this new symbol. The older nobles found it undignified. They preferred lions, eagles, animals that didn't spend their mornings screaming at the sun. But Louis was unmoved. "The lion devours," he reportedly said. "The rooster awakens." That, of course, made it law. Before long, the rooster's likeness appeared on banners, uniforms, and even diplomatic gifts. The Spanish ambassador, ever the pragmatist, once brought a golden egg as tribute, saying it came from the cousin of His Majesty's beloved fowl. It was technically a clock, but the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. By 1509, the royal rooster had his own official title, Le Gardien du Matin, the guardian of the morning. The role was purely ceremonial, but the post came with an annual stipend, meaning the rooster's keeper, a man named Jean de Martigny, effectively drew a royal salary to make sure a bird didn't oversleep. You can imagine how that went down among the court accountants. When Charlemagne eventually died, peacefully, one assumes, though accounts vary, the court entered what one chronicler described as a brief period of solemn quiet. The king reportedly ordered a small wooden cross placed in the garden where the rooster was buried. Then, in what might be history's most unnecessary decree, he announced that a succession would be held. They held auditions. Roosters from all over France were brought to the palace for testing. They were evaluated for punctuality, clarity, and general attitude. According to the archives, one bird was disqualified for crowing insolently at the cardinal. Another, from Gascony, was considered too proud, which seems like an odd criticism for a species that naturally struts. Eventually, a replacement was chosen, a plump brown rooster from Tours named Louis, presumably because the naming committee lacked imagination. He was installed with modest ceremony and went on to serve faithfully for 3 years before a fox made its way into the royal gardens and ended his career abruptly. After that, the position of royal rooster keeper quietly disappeared. But the image of the rooster stuck. It spread through France, becoming a kind of unofficial emblem of national pride long before the revolution ever adopted it formally. And it all started with one tired king and one bird that just wouldn't sleep in. Of course, Louis's fascination with roosters didn't exist in a vacuum. It reflected a broader medieval and early modern idea that animals could embody moral lessons. Lions stood for strength, lambs for innocence, and apparently roosters for knowing when to get up. But sometimes, the symbolism got a little out of hand. After Louis's death, later monarchs tried to imitate his gentle pastoral tastes. Francis I, for example, was rumored to have kept peacocks purely for the noise, a decision that probably made his neighbors hate him. And in one bizarre twist, Henry II briefly commissioned a painting of himself with a rooster at his feet, symbolizing vigilance. Unfortunately, the artist gave the bird such an awkward expression that the court started calling it the king's double. The painting quietly disappeared soon after. Still, the connection between French kings and roosters endured. Chroniclers noted it, theologians rationalized it, and peasants, ever fond of irony, began calling their own chickens Little Louis in mock respect. It's strange, isn't it? How a symbol that began as an overfed palace bird would, centuries later, become a revolutionary emblem of France itself. The proud Gallic rooster, strutting on coins and flags, tracing its lineage back not to myth or legend, but to one mildly insomniac monarch and his pet poultry. If he'd known that, Louis XII probably would have smiled. Or maybe sighed. He did that a lot. Let's wander now to one of the stranger corners of this feathery chronicle, a medieval town that didn't just argue over a rooster's crow but tried to legislate it. Because when religion, bureaucracy, and poultry collide, the results are exactly as ridiculous as you'd imagine. Chapter 8. The Town That Tried to Regulate Dawn. There are few things in life as predictable as sunrise, taxes, and the sound of a rooster announcing both. But in the year 1532, the citizens of a small town in Burgundy decided that the first of these needed to be better organized. The town of St. Florent was neither large nor remarkable. It had a modest church, a muddy square, and a population of about 200 people who all believed, quite sincerely, that their town was the center of civilization. It also had one problem, a rooster named Guillaume. Guillaume belonged to a widow named Marguerite Dupont, who lived near the town well. He was, by all accounts, a very healthy bird, loud, punctual, and possessed of a confidence that bordered on theological. Each morning, before the first hint of light touched the church steeple, Guillaume would let out a crow so powerful that people said it split dreams in half. The first complaint came from the local baker, who claimed the bird's early calls ruined his dough-rising schedule. Then the parish priest grumbled that the rooster's cries drowned out his morning prayers. By midsummer, half the town was losing sleep and the other half was losing patience. So they did what medieval towns always did when faced with a problem too absurd for common sense. They called a meeting. The town council of St. Florent gathered in the old wine hall, where they had once debated such serious matters as whose goat ate whose cabbage, and whether the well should be blessed twice a year or 3 times. Presiding over the meeting was Mayor Etienne Laroche, a man so fond of procedure that he once made his own children sign a charter before playing in the garden. After several minutes of solemn murmuring, the council agreed that something must be done about Guillaume. The question, however, was what? Some suggested fining Marguerite for disturbing the peace. Others proposed relocating the rooster to the edge of town, perhaps near the mill, where his enthusiasm could be directed at the wheat instead of the populace. One councilman, a retired soldier, argued that killing the bird outright would be the most efficient solution, though he was quickly shushed by the priest. After 2 hours of debate, Mayor Laroche finally stood, cleared his throat, and proposed what he called a regulation of dawn. The law, as recorded in the town ledger, stated, "No rooster shall crow before the appointed hour of prime, lest he incur the penalty of confinement or such other measures as the council shall deem fit." In other words, The town had just tried to outlaw sunrise before 6 a.m. Marguerite, upon hearing of the decree, was furious. She argued that Guillaume was simply doing what God intended. "If the Lord made him to crow, who are we to tell him when?" she declared before a gathering of neighbors. The townspeople, deeply suspicious of both theology and volume, remained unmoved. A few days later, Guillaume crowed, right on schedule, which is to say too early. The council promptly fined Marguerite 2 sous. She refused to pay. The following morning, the bird crowed again, and the fine doubled. By the third offense, the mayor ordered that Guillaume be seized pending trial. And yes, they really held a trial. On a cloudy Thursday in September, the entire town assembled in the square. A local scribe recorded the proceedings. Guillaume was placed in a small wooden cage in front of the council table. The priest presided, the mayor acted as prosecutor, and Marguerite, in what must have been the least enviable role of her life, served as the bird's defense counsel. Mayor Laroche began with a dramatic speech about civic harmony and the sanctity of rest. "If one rooster may crow at his pleasure," he thundered, "then chaos shall reign from coop to cathedral." Marguerite countered that Guillaume was no mere nuisance, but a creature of divine order. "He heralds the sun as surely as bells mark the hour," she said. "Would you silence the bells too?" The crowd murmured approvingly. The priest looked torn between doctrine and the desire for uninterrupted sleep. When asked for witnesses, several neighbors stepped forward. One claimed that Guillaume had crowed as early as the second hour after midnight. Another insisted he had startled a cow into producing sour milk. A third, the baker, alleged that the bird's call caused his apprentices to drop 3 loaves, which, he dramatically added, were never the same again. After much deliberation and one brief pause for lunch, the council reached a compromise. Guillaume would be allowed to live but must be confined to his coop until the first clear sign of dawn. Marguerite, relieved, agreed. Guillaume, naturally, did not. For 3 days, peace reigned in St. Florent. Then, on the 4th morning, a cloud covered the horizon, and the rooster, confused by the lack of light, remained silent until nearly mid-morning. The townspeople, delighted to sleep late, declared the law a success. But later that week, a merchant from Dijon arrived in town with news that made the entire ordeal look ridiculous. In his city, he said, roosters crowed freely, and the people there had learned to sleep through it. "You get used to it," he shrugged, "like bells or gossip." This revelation spread quickly, and before long, St. Florent began to doubt the wisdom of its own regulation. After all, it was embarrassing to have one's rooster laws mocked by the next town over. Within a month, the ordinance was quietly repealed. Guillaume was released from confinement and resumed his regular duties. The mayor issued no formal apology but reportedly began wearing earplugs. Years later, travelers would pass through St. Florent and hear locals proudly tell the story of the rooster who defeated the law. Children grew up repeating it as a moral fable about nature's rhythm triumphing over bureaucracy. And Marguerite, who lived well into her 70s, liked to say she'd once won a trial against the morning itself. The real irony, of course, is that Guillaume lived just long enough to be replaced by a rooster far louder than he ever was. The town briefly considered reinstating the old law, but by then, everyone had learned the futility of legislating the sky. Sometimes, the world simply wakes up when it wants to. Chapter 9. The monks who invented alarm clocks, accidentally. Monks were not, by nature, morning people, despite the rumors. They were early risers by obligation, not enthusiasm. It was part of their job description. Wake before dawn, shuffle to the chapel, mumble Latin in half-conscious reverence, and pretend they weren't silently calculating how many hours until breakfast. The problem, of course, was timing. Medieval monasteries ran on strict schedules, a daily rhythm known as the liturgy of the hours. There were prayers at matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. If that sounds exhausting, it's because it was. The entire day was divided into divine appointments, each one meant to keep monks closer to God and, incidentally, far away from any real sleep. In theory, these hours were marked by sunlight. In practice, sunlight was a terrible clock. So began one of the strangest and most passive-aggressive technological developments of the Middle Ages, the invention of the alarm. At first, monasteries used human timekeepers, usually a bleary-eyed novice whose sole job was to stay awake all night and ring a bell when the hour arrived. This was, predictably, a disaster. Most of these poor souls dozed off halfway through the Psalms, earning stern lectures about discipline and the devil's temptations. To solve this problem, some particularly inventive monks began experimenting with mechanical contraptions. The Cistercians were especially fond of tinkering, equal parts pious and nerdy. They believed that if God had blessed mankind with hands and spare hours, he must have meant them to be used for engineering. And so, somewhere in the damp stone halls of a 12th century abbey, a group of monks started fiddling with water clocks. These were essentially jars that dripped at a steady rate, slowly filling a lower container. When the bottom vessel overflowed, it tipped a lever, which rang a small bell. It was brilliant. It was simple. It was also incredibly noisy. The first monastic alarm clock was said to have gone off with such a violent clang that it woke the abbot 3 hours early, which, depending on your perspective, was either a failure or a miracle. Still, the idea caught on. Monasteries across Europe began installing increasingly elaborate devices, rotating drums, candle timers, even early gears that turned figurines to mark the hour. It's easy to picture the scene. A quiet cloister filled with the faint trickle of water, the soft creak of wood, and then, at some ungodly hour, clang. Every monk within earshot groans, mutters a prayer for patience, and trudges to the chapel like penitents of punctuality. The irony was that monks had originally retreated from the noise and chaos of worldly life, and ended up creating the medieval equivalent of the office alarm system. In one abbey in northern France, records show that the bell ringer was replaced entirely by a mechanism built by a brother Guillaume, not to be confused with the rooster from the previous chapter, though one could argue they shared a spiritual kinship. Guillaume the monk reportedly constructed a device powered by falling weights and pulleys that could trigger bells automatically. His fellow brothers were so impressed that they petitioned for him to build one for the kitchen too, for the regulation of broth. Soon, the sound of bells became so regular, so embedded in daily life, that entire towns began setting their routines by monastic schedules. Bakers started their ovens when the abbey's bell rang at prime. Farmers paused their work at sext. Even children were scolded for being late by the bells. In a strange way, the monks had accidentally synchronized medieval Europe. The rhythm of prayer became the rhythm of life. But as with all great inventions, not everyone was happy. A few abbots began to complain that the mechanical bells were too efficient. Without the human error of sleepy novices, monks now had no excuse for tardiness. Attendance at matins rose dramatically. Grumbling in the refectory followed accordingly. One chronicler from the 13th century, writing from Canterbury, lamented that the new devices left no room for mercy. In his account, a mechanical bell did so pierce the stillness of night that none could feign ignorance of the hour. Translation: no more pretending you didn't hear the wake-up call. The psychological toll was real. Monks who had once drifted through the night in gentle ignorance now lived in anxious anticipation of that dreaded clang. One modern historian described it, perhaps too aptly, as a medieval form of workplace anxiety. Of course, outside the monastery, people took note of these devices. Merchants, townsfolk, and minor nobles began requesting their own versions. The wealthy wanted clocks not for prayer, but for control, to keep servants on schedule and to ensure that feasts began precisely when guests were too hungry to be polite. Thus, the monastic alarm escaped the cloister walls and entered secular life. By the late 14th century, rudimentary mechanical clocks adorned church towers and civic halls. The same bells that once woke monks now regulated markets, curfews, and marriages. And yet, for all their cleverness, no one really enjoyed it. A monk in Flanders supposedly remarked that time was gentler before we learned to measure it. Another, in a moment of half-asleep honesty, added, "I sometimes miss the days when we could just blame the rooster." By the Renaissance, the idea of an alarm, from the Italian alarm, meaning to arms, had become embedded in daily vocabulary. It once meant a call to battle. Now it was simply what got you out of bed. Humanity had taken a war cry and turned it into a morning routine. So, the next time your alarm clock jolts you awake, remember, it was designed by monks who just wanted to make sure they didn't oversleep their prayers. A noble goal, perhaps, but one that set in motion centuries of collective groaning. And somewhere in the great celestial ledger, there's probably a note of divine irony beside their invention, well-intentioned, but widely regretted. Let's drift forward now, away from the stone abbeys and sleepless sanctuaries, to another peculiar chapter in the history of medieval mornings, one that involves pride, paranoia, and yet another argument over who deserved the first light of day. Chapter 10. The Dawn Wars, when villages competed for sunrise rights. If you ever thought modern towns get petty about property lines or parade routes, medieval Europe would like a word, or, more precisely, a legal charter about the sun. Yes, there was a time when several villages in what is now southern Germany entered into a very polite, very bureaucratic feud over who got to see the sunrise first. It sounds ridiculous, and it was, but beneath the absurdity lay something very medieval: pride. The kind of pride that made towns paint their coats of arms on everything from bread ovens to cows, and that could turn a weather pattern into a status symbol. The earliest mention of this dawn dispute appears in a dusty 14th century civic record from Swabia. It describes two towns, Kirchdorf and Oberstdorf, both claiming that their village was the first blessed by the rays of God's morning light. It started innocently enough. Kirchdorf, located on a slightly higher hill, declared itself the town closest to heaven. It was a marketing move before marketing existed. Pilgrims passing through were told they could witness the very first sunrise over the Lord's earth. Naturally, Oberstdorf took offense. Their mayor, a man named Hans Myler, described by one chronicler as fond of wine and argument in equal measure, countered that his town, being further east, must see the sunrise first. "Hills," he wrote, "do not make men holier." The argument might have ended there, with a few grumbled insults traded at the local market, but medieval pride had no off switch. Within weeks, both towns began collecting evidence. Kirchdorf's monks claimed to have measured the exact time of dawn using the shadow of their bell tower. Oberstdorf's priest, not to be outdone, stationed a novice on the church roof every morning to record the instant light touches the steeple. Imagine being that poor novice, shivering at 4 in the morning with a quill and a candle stub, trying to decide which faint streak of gray in the sky counted as official sunlight. By midsummer, the rivalry had escalated into what later chroniclers called the Dawn Wars, though in truth, there were no battles. Just an exhausting series of petitions, public declarations, and one incident involving stolen church bells. The bells, it turned out, were central to the argument. Each town rang its morning bell the moment the rooster crowed or light appeared, whichever came first. Hearing the other's bell first was an unforgivable humiliation. So one night, a group of Kirchdorf youths crept into Oberstdorf and removed the clapper from their bell, effectively silencing it. The next morning, Kirchdorf rang proudly, Oberstdorf fumed, and the local bishop received a complaint so long that it had to be rolled rather than folded. The Bishop of Augsburg, already juggling disputes about grain taxes and heresy, had little patience for what he called the quarrels of the dawn. Nevertheless, he summoned both towns to a formal arbitration. The hearing took place in a small stone chapel halfway between the two villages, a symbolic middle ground, though one side inevitably argued that it was closer to their border. Witnesses were called. One shepherd testified that his flock always stirred earlier in Oberstdorf. A farmer from Kirchdorf countered that the sheep are lazy liars. The bishop reportedly sighed, rubbed his temples, and muttered something about mankind being truly inventive in its foolishness. Eventually, a compromise was drafted. The bishop decreed that both towns were equally blessed by the sun, as the light of God falls upon all without preference. To prevent further disputes, he ordered that both towns' bells ring at exactly the same time, when a messenger station between them waved a white flag at first light. It worked for about a week. Then, predictably, the messenger began accepting bribes. Oberstdorf gave him a free breakfast. Kirchdorf offered him new boots. Soon he was ringing whichever town fed him better. The rivalry flared again. In desperation, the bishop threatened excommunication for anyone found to be in dispute over the sun. That finally ended the feud, though, privately, the monks of Kirchdorf continued to record sunrise times for another decade, just in case heaven kept score. The tale might have ended there, a quaint footnote of medieval absurdity, if not for the fact that other villages started copying them. Throughout the 15th century, sunrise boasting became a minor regional trend. Town mottos began to include phrases like, "Where the morning shines first," or "First light, first faith." It was a kind of medieval civic one-upmanship, like having the tallest cathedral spire, only less stable and more poetic. In some cases, the competition turned mildly scientific. Scholars attempted to calculate sunrise times using early astrolabes. A few towns even established sun platforms, small raised stone terraces where officials could observe dawn and record the divine hour. In one particularly charming case, a small Bavarian hamlet actually built an artificial hill out of dirt and gravel so they could claim higher elevation. It promptly collapsed in the rain, but not before someone carved into the top stone, "First to light, last to sleep." The obsession eventually faded, as obsessions do, replaced by newer ways to measure prestige: larger markets, richer guilds, taller towers. But the Dawn Wars left their trace. In several regions, old charters still describe the ringing of the first bell as a matter of civic identity. And somewhere in the historical imagination, that rivalry lingers, the idea that even the sunrise can be a contest if you're determined enough. Of course, the ultimate irony is that the earth itself doesn't care. The sun rises when it wishes, angles shift, hills erode, and clouds mock the precision of human pride. But perhaps that was the point all along. The medieval world lived in tension between faith and measurement, between divine order and human ego. And sometimes, all it took to expose that tension was a little bit of light. So, when you next see dawn creeping across the horizon, imagine a monk with a sundial and a farmer with a grudge, both insisting that their side of the valley caught it first. Some arguments, it seems, are eternal. Chapter 11. The Rooster Trials of France, When Birds Face the Law. By the 16th century, France had perfected something historians might call legal absurdity with feathers. If you thought lawsuits over land or debt were tedious, consider the curious phenomenon of the rooster trials, formal legal proceedings where chickens, for reasons that remain partly inexplicable, were treated as defendants. The origin of these trials is rooted in medieval law, which operated under the principle that animals could bear responsibility for harm. This wasn't some philosophical fancy, it was practical. Pigs trampled crops, dogs bit people, and as it turns out, roosters could wake up a town before sunrise. Someone, somewhere, decided that if humans were accountable for misdeeds, why not chickens? One famous case occurred in 1543 in the town of Clermont-Ferrand. A certain citizen, Jacques Fournier, had a particularly aggressive rooster named Huguet. Huguet, it seems, took a personal interest in waking everyone in the village, particularly Monsieur Fournier's neighbor, a widow named Margot. Every morning, Huguet crowed incessantly at the crack of dawn, sometimes flapping aggressively at Margot's window. Margot, understandably, filed a complaint. She claimed that Huguet was a disturber of the peace, a bringer of sleep deprivation, and perhaps in league with the devil. Jacques, naturally, defended his bird. He claimed that Huguet was simply fulfilling her natural duty, crowing at daybreak, and that any offense taken by humans was a matter of personal weakness. The local magistrate, bound by centuries of precedent, convened a court. Witnesses were summoned. One elderly villager swore that the rooster crowed earlier than the sunrise itself. Another noted that Huguet occasionally crowed at odd hours, presumably out of spite. The widow Margot testified with great dignity, though she reportedly dozed off midway through. The trial lasted 3 days. Huguet remained confined in a small wooden box in the courtroom, occasionally flapping her wings and reminding everyone why they were here. Ultimately, the court issued a compromise. Huguet was deemed guilty of minor disturbance, but spared death. Instead, Jacques was ordered to build a small pen away from Margot's windows and to ensure the rooster crowed no earlier than a specified hour, which the magistrate calculated using a sundial and an inexplicable sense of moral timing. This ruling set a precedent. In the following decades, French towns witnessed numerous cases of roosters facing the law, some accused of murder, pecking a child who had climbed too close, others accused of property damage, destroying a cart of vegetables. Most outcomes were a mix of fines, confinement, and ceremonial admonishments. In one particularly bizarre trial in Rouen, a rooster named Guillaume, yes, another Guillaume, was found guilty of defying ecclesiastical authority after waking the bishop during a midnight vigil. The court, showing remarkable ingenuity, exiled the bird to a neighboring village, where it reportedly crowed at precisely the wrong hours for 3 years before vanishing without explanation. The French legal system, despite these absurdities, was surprisingly meticulous. Court records included detailed descriptions of the bird's behavior, witness testimony, and even diagrams of the coops. One clerk went so far as to sketch Huguet's feather patterns to ensure accurate identification, in case the accused was replaced by a lookalike. Interestingly, these trials were more than entertainment. They reveal something profound about medieval society, a desire to impose order even on the natural world. Animals, in this framework, were expected to respect human rules. Roosters that crowed too early were not simply birds, they were symbols of disorder, and prosecuting them was a way for humans to assert control. Of course, the trials were also a little ridiculous. Chroniclers often added flourishes, noting that witnesses wept from lack of sleep, or that the accused bird pecked at the magistrate's wig, perhaps in protest or sheer boredom. These stories, while amusing today, underscore how seriously people once took the morning hours. The trend gradually faded as mechanical clocks and church bells became widespread. By the 17th century, roosters no longer faced the law. Yet the records remain, dusty volumes in French archives, where names, dates, and charges preserve a world in which a crow could disrupt civic life, prompt legal wrangling, and force a bishop to negotiate peace treaties with a chicken. It's tempting to dismiss these trials as quaint, but they tell us a lot about the values of the time. Medieval communities sought order, civility, and fairness, and sometimes extended those ambitions to the most absurd corners of life. In their eyes, a rooster was not merely a bird, it was a participant in the moral and social world. And perhaps, in a quiet sort of way, they were right. The world does not revolve around human sleep alone. As we leave France, let's wander north to Flanders and the Low Countries, where roosters weren't just legal curiosities but the subjects of superstition, poetic lament, and civic ritual. Here, the morning crow held not just practical meaning but spiritual weight, and a single misstep could provoke an entire village. Chapter 12: Flemish Feathers, Superstition, Poetry, and the Sacred Rooster. Moving north to the Low Countries, we find a world where roosters were not merely noisy animals, nor even inconvenient legal entities. In Flanders, during the late medieval period, they were little agents of superstition, poetry, and civic pride all at once. In towns like Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, the crow of a rooster was more than a wake-up call. It was a signal, a portent, and sometimes even a poetic device. Chroniclers tell of roosters crowing at odd hours, and how villagers would consult the bird's patterns for predictions about weather, harvests, or the temperament of visiting merchants. One poem, written in Middle Dutch and preserved in a monastery ledger, begins, "When the cock cries thrice before the sun, the baker's dough shall rise, yet the mill shall run." Scholars today describe it as a cryptic reminder of dawn and routine, though reading it aloud in Flemish at 3 a.m. would likely be sleep-inducing and mildly confusing. The Flemish didn't stop at superstition. They ritualized roosters in civic life. Every town had a central rooster, often painted on the mayor's seal, embroidered on banners, or carved atop market crosses. These birds symbolized vigilance, integrity, and the town's ability to face daybreak with dignity. It's worth noting that this was largely symbolic, because if the town's actual rooster woke anyone before sunrise, it usually caused disputes, fines, or in extreme cases, legal wrangling. There's one story from Ghent that's particularly illustrative. A merchant named Peter van Loo brought a rare white rooster from the countryside into the city square. According to the chronicle, the bird crowed so vigorously that it caused the market bell to hesitate and the pigeons to scatter in confusion. The city council debated whether this was a blessing or an omen. Peter insisted it was a sign of good fortune. The city elders argued that it was a warning of poor trade, and the pigeons, as always, said nothing. In another Flemish town, a poet named Jan Claes wrote a series of short verses about the sacred rooster of Ypres, attributing it moral qualities usually reserved for saints or kings. The bird was said to judge the sluggard, awaken the devout, and mock the insolent. The poem circulated widely, inspiring imitators in nearby villages. Soon, every town with a notable rooster began composing similar lines, as though crowing and rhyming were inseparable duties of dawn. The superstitions surrounding Flemish roosters extended to daily decisions. Farmers would avoid planting onions if the rooster crowed in the wrong direction. Brewers timed the start of fermentation according to certain crowing sequences. Some towns even decreed that any rooster that crowed at midnight should be temporarily confined to prevent unlucky omens from entering the household. It's remarkable how seriously they took this. And yet, when you think about it, it fits the pattern of medieval Europe. Combine nature, divine influence, civic pride, and a little human vanity, and you have a society where birds could shape lives in subtle but meaningful ways. Sometimes, the Flemish also used roosters as moral lessons. Chroniclers tell of a man who overslept for church because he ignored the rooster's call. The sermon following his tardiness reportedly referenced the bird as an instrument of God's patience, and the man, of course, felt ashamed for years. The intertwining of superstition, poetry, and civic ritual reached its peak during festivals. In many towns, annual competitions were held. Which rooster could crow most regularly, which was most vigilant, and in some cases, which could sing at the correct hour for the most consecutive days. Winners were lauded with ribbons, bread, or a symbolic title like Guardian of Dawn, echoing the French royal tradition but adapted to communal life. Interestingly, these practices endured longer than one might expect. Even into the 17th century, certain Flemish chronicles record disputes over misbehaving roosters disrupting prayer or market hours. And while mechanical clocks gradually replaced birds as arbiters of time, the symbolic and literary significance of roosters persisted, immortalized in poems, paintings, and municipal emblems. The moral, if one wishes to assign it, is subtle. In the Low Countries, a rooster was never just a bird. It was a chronometer, a prophet, a civic figure, and occasionally, a critic. It enforced the rhythm of life, inspired literature, and provoked legal debates, all without ever understanding the concept of sunrise. Next, we'll float over to England, where the humble rooster entered the courts not as a poet or symbol, but as a tactical instrument, a bird whose crowing could ignite disputes over property, pride, and public nuisance. England's stories, while less poetic, are perhaps even more absurd because the stakes were so mundane. Chapter 13, England's Rooster Disputes, when crowing meant court cases. England, in the late medieval and early Tudor periods, had a curious relationship with roosters, somewhere between legalistic obsession and practical annoyance. Whereas in Flanders roosters were poetic symbols and in France they could be prosecuted in court, in England they were more likely to cause a neighborly feud that ended with writs, fines, and occasionally jury intervention. One of the earliest recorded cases took place in 1482 in a small village in Norfolk. A farmer named Thomas Wainwright owned a particularly boisterous rooster named Clarence. Yes, he named him after a noble house because why not? Clarence had the habit of crowing precisely at 3:45 a.m., long before dawn, and directly outside the bedroom window of a neighbor, Dame Eleanor, a widow with an affinity for uninterrupted sleep. Dame Eleanor tried gentle persuasion first. She asked Thomas to keep Clarence in the barn until sunrise. Thomas, predictably, refused. He argued that roosters were creatures of God, and their duty was to crow at daybreak, and that if Clarence happened to start a little early, that was just enthusiasm. When negotiation failed, Eleanor did what any self-respecting widow in medieval Norfolk would do. She took the matter to the manor court. The judge, a local squire named William Harcourt, was well acquainted with disputes over fences, goats, and pig trespass. But a rooster was new territory. Witnesses were called. The baker testified that Clarence's early crowing sometimes startled his apprentice, causing flour to spill. A shepherd claimed the bird's cries were unsettling to the flock, and Thomas himself insisted that the rooster is simply diligent. The jury, after a long deliberation punctuated by yawns and groans, ruled in Eleanor's favor. Clarence was to be confined to the henhouse until the official hour of sunrise, with Thomas fined a modest sum for nuisance. Clarence, naturally, found loopholes, and the record notes several instances where he was caught crowing at the witching hour, a term the squire apparently applied loosely to any time before 4 a.m. Other cases followed similar patterns. In Suffolk, a man named Robert Carew was taken to court because his rooster allegedly attacked a visiting dignitary by flapping its wings and pecking at his boots. In Shropshire, a particularly territorial bird caused a riot when two neighboring farmers both claimed it belonged to them, a dispute so heated that the local constable had to physically separate the parties before the bell rang for matins. These English disputes highlight something fascinating about the period. Law and daily life were intertwined in ways that seem almost comical today. Animals weren't merely property, they were participants in communal existence, capable of creating legal friction. Roosters, in particular, were uniquely disruptive. They were loud, unpredictable, and morally neutral, a combination that made them ideal protagonists in medieval minor litigation. It's worth noting that English courts were remarkably precise in their rulings. Often, the records specify not only the time the rooster may crow but also the location. The defendant's rooster may crow within the eastern yard, but not in the western chamber or near the common well, reads one 16th century manuscript. Some towns even established rooster curfews, an early form of noise ordinance. One particularly delightful case comes from Devon, where a rooster named Reginald was accused of causing emotional distress. A young girl claimed she had nightmares after the bird crowed incessantly for 3 nights in a row. The court, after consulting witnesses and assessing the evidence, ruled that Reginald was to be confined and observed for further offenses. The chronicler dryly notes that Reginald displayed no remorse. These disputes often blended humor, irritation, and civic concern. Chroniclers of the time occasionally inserted wry commentary in the margins. Roosters, it seems, obey no man, disturb no one at their peril, and are, in general, unreasonable creatures. Others speculated that some roosters were, in fact, used intentionally as instruments of revenge, a bird left unconfined outside a neighbor's window as a form of petty warfare. By the late Tudor period, English towns had largely moved on. Mechanical clocks, church bells, and the standardization of time reduced the need to litigate over crowing birds. Yet the court records remain, a testament to human ingenuity applied to a very specific and persistent problem: noisy poultry. The English cases share a common theme with French and Flemish examples: the intersection of daily life, legal authority, and animal behavior. Unlike modern cities, where noise ordinances are enforced with impersonal fines, medieval communities were intimate enough that even a rooster could become a matter of public concern, moral debate, and courtroom drama. And so, from Norfolk to Devon, from village greens to manor courts, the crowing of a rooster became both an annoyance and a measure of civic order, a reminder that in medieval Europe, even the simplest natural acts could ripple outward, shaping society in curious and unintended ways. Next, we'll drift over to Italy, where roosters were not just nuisances but symbols in art and folklore, small birds whose symbolic weight far exceeded their actual size or volume. Chapter 14. The Italian Rooster Guilds, Pride, Policy, and Poultry. In Italy, by the late Renaissance, roosters had become something of a civic obsession, though in a uniquely Italian way. Towns like Florence, Siena, and Bologna treated their roosters not just as birds or symbols, but as participants in municipal pride, competitive politics, and occasionally legalized squabbles. In Florence, the rooster had a long-standing association with vigilance and prosperity. Wealthy families would keep prized birds not only to wake them in the morning, but to display at the market square, showing off both their careful breeding and their attention to civic duty. One chronicler notes that a particularly aggressive rooster was a mark of personal prestige. If a Florentine's bird crows first, it signals the owner's dominance over both Don and his neighbors. To manage this, Florence established informal but well-documented rooster guilds. These were associations of owners, breeders, and caretakers who maintained records of crowing schedules, lineage, and behavior. Guild meetings, held monthly, involved debates over which rooster had the most punctual wake-up call, who produced the loudest crow, and which birds were properly disciplined. The guilds also issued fines for misbehavior, for example, if a rooster escaped and disrupted another household. Siena took it further. In the 1570s, the city instituted what one historian called Regolamento del Gallo, essentially a codified set of laws governing rooster behavior. These decrees specified acceptable crowing hours, prohibited nocturnal crowing, and even determined penalties for owners who failed to train their birds properly. Chroniclers note that the city council occasionally had to mediate disputes in which a rooster crowed too close to a rival's property line, resulting in arguments over honor, reputation, and, occasionally, minor property damage. One amusing account describes a baker whose rooster was accused of waking the magistrate too early. The trial included testimony from multiple witnesses, diagrams of the baker's yard, and calculations of sunrise times. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the magistrate, awarding him a small loaf of bread daily as compensation, and instructed the baker to remind his rooster of proper civic duties. Even Venice, famous for canals and intrigue, had a fascination with roosters. In some neighborhoods, roosters were used as unofficial timekeepers for merchants operating in markets along the Grand Canal. Chroniclers describe roosters perched on windowsills, crowing on schedule while gondoliers and merchants synchronized their activities to the sound. Guilds, regulations, and municipal fascination turned the rooster into a quasi-public servant. Owners were proud, authorities were satisfied, and townspeople occasionally complained, though often privately, for fear of being accused of undermining civic pride. In effect, the rooster became a tool for social cohesion, a way to maintain order through natural sound and human oversight. The Italian approach contrasts sharply with the Northern European obsession with superstition. While Flemish towns treated roosters as moral arbiters or spiritual signs, and French towns tried them in court, Italian cities celebrated their practical utility while layering civic pride and personal competition over them. Yet all of this, of course, was both charming and absurd. People dedicated real energy to regulating the crow of a bird, to measuring its punctuality, and to formalizing disputes over its behavior. And it worked, at least until the clocks arrived, at which point all these carefully recorded rivalries gradually became curious anecdotes for historians. By the end of the 16th century, Italian rooster guilds persisted mostly in tradition and ceremony. The birds themselves, ever oblivious to law or pride, continued to crow as they had for millennia, loud, early, and without concern for social hierarchy. It's a pattern we've seen across Europe. The same creatures, the same calls, inspiring laws, trials, poetry, guilds, and civic rituals. And through it all, humans tried to impose order, interpret meaning, and claim authority over dawn itself. Next, we'll drift eastward to Germany, where rooster-related disputes were less poetic and more bureaucratic, often involving fines, regulations, and very patient magistrates. Chapter 15. German Dawn Regulations, When the Law Woke the Village. By the 17th century, parts of Germany had developed a particularly disciplined relationship with roosters. Unlike the poetic musings of Flanders or the civic competitions of Italy, German towns leaned heavily into bureaucracy, rules, and, unsurprisingly, fines. In small villages scattered across Bavaria, Saxony, and the Rhineland, it was not uncommon for municipal authorities to issue written ordinances regulating the crowing of roosters. The laws were precise. Roosters could not crow before certain hours, must not harass neighbors, and in some towns, could not be fed after dark to prevent premature vocalizations. Violations were punishable with a fine, confiscation, or, in extreme cases, temporary removal of the offending bird. One notable case comes from the town of Altenburg, where a farmer named Dietrich Müller owned a particularly energetic rooster named Fritz. Fritz had a habit of crowing at 3:30 in the morning, well before sunrise. Neighbors lodged complaints, claiming the rooster was a scourge to our slumber and our morning prayers. The town council, after careful deliberation, issued a formal summons. Dietrich appeared with Fritz, who was as oblivious as any rooster could be. Witnesses testified about Fritz's disruptive behavior. The baker swore that his dough failed to rise due to unseemly interruptions, while the widow Kramer insisted she had developed an irritable disposition as a direct result of the rooster's antics. The council ruled that Fritz must be confined during the early hours and that Dietrich would face a daily fine if Fritz crowed before the appointed hour. Dietrich attempted to argue that Fritz, as a creature of nature, could not be controlled, but the magistrates were unmoved. Nature, apparently, needed bureaucracy. Elsewhere in Saxony, another village had even more elaborate procedures. Rooster inspectors were appointed, usually elderly men with excellent hearing and no love for sleep, tasked with monitoring the first crow each day. These inspectors would carry small notebooks, record times, and report violations to the council. Chroniclers of the period note that disputes sometimes escalated into lengthy arguments over seconds. The crow occurred 3 minutes before the designated hour, therefore the penalty applies. One entry reads, "In many ways, this German approach reflects the broader tendencies of the time. Efficiency, order, and legalistic precision applied to the mundane." While elsewhere in Europe the rooster was a symbol, a poet, or a civic competitor, here it was a rule-bound participant in the machinery of village life. Interestingly, the regulations sometimes took creative forms. In the village of Würzburg, a law stated that any rooster crowing before sunrise must be given a small portion of straw to remind it of its responsibilities. The same ordinance also allowed neighbors to gently nudge the offending bird, provided they did so without harm. This mix of punishment and guidance reflects a kind of pragmatic cruelty only medieval law could muster. Despite all efforts, enforcement was inconsistent. Roosters did not consult legal codes before crowing. Some birds were careful, perhaps accidentally, while others maintained a stubborn independence. Villagers often blamed neighbors' roosters instead, and small feuds erupted over which bird was the true culprit. One particularly amusing entry in the Altenburg ledger describes a dispute where two farmers accused each other's roosters of early crowing. The council's solution was to have both birds crow simultaneously in front of a magistrate. The rooster that crowed last was deemed the responsible party, which caused both farmers to grumble and both birds to remain entirely unimpressed. By the mid-18th century, mechanical clocks began to reduce reliance on roosters, but the regulations persisted in some villages for decades. Legal documents, petitions, and town records contain repeated references to roosters disturbing the peace long after the practical need had faded. The German approach stands out in this history for its sheer dedication to order. Unlike whimsical poems, symbolic civic rituals, or theatrical trials, these regulations treated roosters as entities to be managed, measured, and disciplined. And in doing so, they reflect something profoundly human: the attempt to impose control over a world that refuses to pause for bureaucracy. As we move forward, we'll return briefly to France and England to explore one final phenomenon: the occasional mass uproar caused when roosters refused to behave, sparking town-wide disputes that combined humor, law, and mild panic. These stories remind us that even the smallest creatures could provoke enormous human energy, a theme that, as we've seen, repeats across centuries and borders. Chapter 16: When Roosters Sparked Town-Wide Riots. By the 18th century, most people had accepted that roosters were inherently inconvenient. Yet, despite the prevalence of mechanical clocks and stricter regulations, there were moments when one bird, or a few, could still ignite full-scale civic unrest. One such incident occurred in the northern French town of Amiens around 1723. The town had a long history of disputing roosters' wake-up calls, but this particular feud was fueled by more than just early mornings. It combined pride, property lines, and that inexplicable stubbornness humans often display when they feel wronged by something with feathers. The trouble began with a rooster owned by a man named Etienne Caron. His bird, dubbed Petit Roy for its majestic red comb, had a habit of crowing at precisely 4:45 a.m. in the summer months. This was significantly earlier than the legal sunrise hour decreed by the municipal council and far enough in advance to ruin breakfast preparations, chores, and most importantly, sleep. Neighbors tried polite negotiation. They begged, cajoled, and occasionally bribed Etienne to confine Petit Roy during early hours. Etienne refused, arguing that the bird was simply fulfilling its natural duty. Negotiation failed. Complaints escalated to the town magistrate, who, after hearing both sides, ruled that Petit Roy must be confined until sunrise or face a fine. Etienne, characteristically, ignored the decree. Matters reached a breaking point one midsummer morning. Petit Roy, unsurprisingly, crowed before dawn, waking dozens of households. Sleep-deprived townsfolk converged on Etienne's property, armed with brooms, sticks, and the occasional egg. A scuffle ensued. Fences were trampled, laundry was ruined, and one particularly unfortunate goose got caught in the chaos. The incident escalated into what was later described in municipal records as the Rooster Riot of Amiens. Over 24 citizens participated, and the mayor himself was called to mediate. By the end of the day, Etienne had been fined, Petit Roy had been temporarily confined, and the town council issued a new ordinance specifying that any bird crowing before the legally recognized hour would be considered a public nuisance. Similar incidents peppered European history. In England, a 1738 case in Kent describes villagers storming a farm because a rooster repeatedly woke the magistrate's wife. In Bavaria, a particularly noisy rooster in 1751 prompted a petition signed by 20 households requesting that the bird be temporarily relocated until it can be properly trained or replaced. These episodes highlight a curious tension. On the one hand, roosters were small and powerless, hardly capable of willful rebellion. On the other, humans projected enormous social, legal, and moral expectations onto them. A crow at the wrong time could disrupt prayers, commerce, rest, or personal pride, and communities responded as though the rooster had committed a deliberate offense. Interestingly, the chaos often had unintended consequences. The Amiens riot, for example, prompted the council to create a small committee devoted to monitoring all roosters in town. Members kept detailed logs of crowing times, complaints, and compliance with ordinances. This committee, though ostensibly a solution, became a source of local amusement and minor corruption as townspeople bribed inspectors to overlook certain birds. Across Europe, the pattern repeats. France, Germany, England, Italy, and the Low Countries all demonstrate this same combination of humor, annoyance, and bureaucracy. Roosters, seemingly insignificant, became catalysts for lawmaking, poetry, civic pride, and even violent confrontation. Yet, despite all these conflicts, one constant remained: roosters continued to crow. They did not care about ordinances, guilds, magistrates, or municipal pride. The world, it seems, was theirs to wake, and humans were merely negotiators at the mercy of dawn. The pattern of early modern European towns is clear. Roosters were symbols, nuisances, timekeepers, moral arbiters, and occasionally the sparks of public disorder. Their influence, though quiet and often ridiculous, shaped civic life in subtle and persistent ways. And while mechanical clocks would eventually assume many of their duties, the legacy of the rooster remains. In town records, legal codes, poetry, and the occasional sleepy complaint passed down through generations. From here, our journey turns to the whimsical, yet strangely structured world of royal poultry, exploring how kings and nobles extended this fascination with roosters into the highest levels of society, sometimes seriously and sometimes entirely absurdly. Chapter 17. Royal Roosters, when crowing became courtly business. By the 18th century, it wasn't just small villages that were obsessed with roosters. European courts had developed a taste for ritual, symbolism, and, occasionally, absurdity, and roosters fit neatly into all three categories. Take, for example, the court of Louis XV in France. Courtiers were expected to rise early, dress meticulously, and perform a series of ceremonious duties, all punctuated by precise timing. Naturally, some nobles took it upon themselves to employ roosters as a form of personal alarm system. The most famous was a bird named Marquis, kept by the Count of Toulouse. Marquis reportedly crowed with such punctuality that servants set their watches by him. He was treated as a valued member of the household, complete with a miniature gilded perch and a diet befitting his station. Oats from Normandy, occasionally supplemented with a taste of brandied fruit. Marquis's crowing was more than practical. It was a statement of prestige. To own a rooster that reliably announced the morning signified control, refinement, and subtle mastery over nature. Other nobles, naturally, felt compelled to compete. One memoir from Versailles recounts that a duchess once threatened to exile a neighbor's bird for improper crowing, insisting that her own rooster's superior punctuality reflected better breeding, both of bird and human. Meanwhile, in England, King George II reportedly kept a series of roosters at Kensington Palace. These birds were particularly noisy, and courtiers complained that they frequently interrupted morning audiences. A memorandum from the royal household specifies a schedule for rooster crowing, assigning each bird to a specific wing of the palace so as not to wake the monarch too early. Some historians speculate that the birds were less obedient than the schedule, and that palace staff spent considerable time shushing, bribing, or otherwise managing their behavior. In smaller courts across the Holy Roman Empire, roosters assumed quasi-official duties. A minor prince in Saxony awarded his most reliable bird a Medal of Punctuality and required the court jester to accompany it to the chapel every morning, announcing the rooster's arrival in rhyme. The court historian noted that the arrangement promoted both amusement and discipline, though later accounts suggest that the jester often forgot his lines, creating mild confusion during prayers. Italy, ever the stage for ceremonial flair, had a different approach. In Venice, some patrician households kept roosters not merely for waking the household but as participants in social gatherings. Guests were sometimes entertained by the bird's crowing, with owners arranging competitions to determine which rooster could announce dawn most dramatically or with the most extended crow. Winning birds were celebrated with ribbons, treats, or even poetic tributes, and losing birds were quietly removed to quieter quarters. Interestingly, this fascination was not purely whimsical. Roosters were considered omens and symbols. In France, the Gallic rooster had long been a symbol of vigilance, pride, and courage, a motif that eventually became nationalized. Royal courts appreciated these qualities, and ceremonial display of roosters reinforced themes of order, vigilance, and hierarchy. Thus, crowing was never just noise, it was a statement of power. Yet, for all the grandeur, there were the inevitable human frustrations. Courtiers often muttered about birds that refused to obey schedules, crowed too early, or, worse, refused to crow at all. Complaints were recorded in diaries, letters, and household memoranda. One particularly snarky note by an unnamed French chamberlain reads, "His Majesty's rooster, though adorned with golden spurs, persists in waking the Duke of Lorraine before it is fitting. I suspect it conspires with the sun." Even kings and nobles were not immune to the stubbornness of birds. Roosters disrupted formal breakfasts, embarrassed ladies-in-waiting, and occasionally incited minor courtly disputes over ownership or feeding. The moral, it seems, extends across all levels of society. Whether peasant or prince, human attempts to control roosters were almost always at the mercy of nature's stubborn rhythms. In a subtle sense, these royal roosters connect directly to the broader history of civic disputes, mechanical alarms, and rural regulations. From the lowliest village to Versailles, the same tensions played out. Humans sought control, birds followed instinct, and everyone else had to adjust accordingly. As Europe moved toward the Enlightenment, the symbolic and ceremonial role of roosters continued, even as mechanical clocks began to dominate schedules. These birds became emblematic of continuity, a living reminder that despite laws, regulations, or gilded chambers, nature remained indifferent to human hierarchy. Next, we'll move on to a rather peculiar series of events in the Netherlands and northern Germany, where rooster obsession reached the peak of municipal bureaucracy, complete with fines, licenses, and almost a fanatical attention to scheduling. Chapter 18. The Northern Netherlands. Licenses, fines, and obsessive timing. In the Low Countries, particularly in the provinces that now make up the Netherlands, roosters were less celebrated for poetry or prestige and more regulated with an almost bureaucratic zeal. By the 18th century, many towns had formal ordinances controlling everything from the hours a rooster could crow to the exact placement of its coop. Take the town of Haarlem, for example. In 1736, municipal records describe a system whereby every household that kept a rooster was required to register it with the town clerk. Owners were issued a small license, complete with the bird's name, age, and a brief description of its coloration. Failure to register a rooster could result in a fine, and repeated infractions occasionally led to temporary confiscation. The logic behind this system was simple, if slightly obsessive: prevent complaints, minimize disputes, and ensure that the rhythms of communal life were predictable. Crowing before an officially sanctioned hour could disturb workers, shopkeepers, or students, and towns sought to avoid litigation. In a society increasingly focused on order, measurement, and punctuality, roosters could not be left to their own devices. A particularly detailed case involved a rooster named Klaus, owned by a baker on the edge of town. Klaus had a habit of crowing roughly 10 minutes before sunrise, which triggered complaints from 3 neighboring households. The town council convened a formal hearing. Witnesses were called, including a young apprentice who testified about the precise time of each morning's crow. Maps of the baker's property were drawn, distances measured, and eventually, a fine was levied. The baker was ordered to confine Klaus during the critical half-hour before sunrise. Elsewhere in Groningen, authorities took things even further. They mandated inspections by a small committee of town elders, who were charged with ensuring that roosters obeyed the official schedule. Inspectors were expected to maintain logs of violations, assign penalties, and occasionally mediate disputes between owners whose birds seemed to provoke one another. Chroniclers note that this created a minor cottage industry. People began keeping timely roosters specifically to avoid fines, while others attempted to manipulate clocks or coops to create the illusion of obedience. This obsession with scheduling was not limited to urban centers. Rural villages also imposed strict rules. A peasant in Friesland, for example, might be required to adjust feeding times or coop placements so that his bird did not crow prematurely. Neighbors were permitted to lodge formal complaints, and in some cases, officials physically measured the rooster's crowing distance to determine culpability. The meticulous attention to roosters reflects broader Dutch societal trends in the 18th century. Precision, civic responsibility, and order were valued highly, sometimes extending even to the smallest animals. Roosters were no longer merely symbolic, poetic, or ceremonial. They were municipal timekeepers, minor lawbreakers, and subjects of official oversight. Of course, the roosters themselves were indifferent. Despite licenses, fines, and inspections, they continued to crow according to instinct. Chroniclers often note the irony: townspeople meticulously recording every feathered offense while the birds carried on, oblivious, as if mocking human attempts to impose order on nature. One amusing anecdote from Leeuwarden illustrates this perfectly. A particularly stubborn rooster, nicknamed De Vroge, the early one, was caught crowing before sunrise for weeks on end. The town council fined the owner, who attempted to argue that the rooster was merely following God's light. The magistrates, unconvinced, threatened to impound the bird, which prompted a small public protest. Neighbors gathered to watch the rooster's confinement, cheer for its defiance, and laugh quietly at the absurdity of the situation. Through these stories, we see a recurring theme in European history. Humans desire control, birds are indifferent, and conflicts arise wherever the two intersect. In the Netherlands, the obsession with precision and municipal regulation turned roosters into minor bureaucratic actors, a legacy that, while largely forgotten today, once consumed significant civic energy. As we move forward, we'll explore the final chapter of our story, the slow decline of rooster authority and the rise of mechanical clocks, which eventually took over both rural and urban timekeeping. Though, for a few centuries, no invention could entirely replace the persistent, stubborn, crowing bird. Chapter 19. Mechanical Clocks versus Roosters. The End of an Era. By the late 18th century, the relentless crowing of roosters, which had once shaped village life, inspired poetry, sparked riots, and prompted legal debates, began to meet a new rival, the mechanical clock. For centuries, human civilization had relied on these feathered alarm clocks, granting them authority over mornings, schedules, and social order. But as technology advanced, the balance of power slowly shifted. In towns across Europe, especially in wealthier urban centers, tower clocks and personal timepieces started to replace birds as arbiters of daily life. The shift was gradual, punctuated by both awe and skepticism. Tower clocks, often mounted on churches or town halls, rang at precisely calculated intervals. Their bells carried farther than any rooster's crow, and they obeyed neither whim nor diet. Municipal councils began to realize that a mechanical timekeeper did not require fines, licenses, or inspections. Yet the transition was not without resistance or humor. In rural villages, roosters remained stubbornly loyal to their natural schedules. Townspeople found themselves consulting both birds and clocks for accuracy, resulting in a kind of temporal duality. Chroniclers note amusing disputes. One household insisted that their rooster was more reliable than the clock, while another dismissed the bird entirely as outdated technology. Some towns attempted hybrid solutions. In a village in Bavaria, records from 1783 show that a particularly boisterous rooster was outfitted with a small bell on its perch. The bell rang only after the rooster crowed, ensuring that the first crow was officially sanctioned before being broadcast to the community. Town elders described this as a compromise between tradition and progress, though historians today view it as evidence of human stubbornness more than ingenuity. By the early 19th century, personal clocks and alarm devices had become affordable for many households. Bakers, merchants, and clergy could now rely on accurate instruments to regulate their routines. Roosters, deprived of their official role, were relegated to symbolic or decorative positions. Poems continued to celebrate them, festivals continued to honor them, but their influence over civic and domestic life waned. Even so, the legacy of the rooster persisted. Mechanical clocks mimicked the rituals once established by birds. Bell-ringing schedules reflected patterns that villages had long used to structure work, prayer, and communal gatherings. The rhythms of life that roosters had once dictated remained intact, even as the birds themselves became largely irrelevant to human planning. Interestingly, the human attachment to roosters did not entirely disappear. In some regions, roosters continued to be celebrated in heraldry, civic emblems, and literary works. In France, the Gallic rooster became a symbol of national pride, vigilant and persistent, echoing centuries of its morning authority. In the Netherlands, rural festivals still featured competitions and ceremonies that honored the historical importance of roosters in regulating daily life. From a broader perspective, the rise of mechanical clocks illustrates a recurring theme in European history. Humans attempt to impose order, nature resists, and eventually, technology mediates the conflict. Roosters were among the first living timekeepers, their instincts harnessed, regulated, and celebrated. Clocks were impersonal but reliable, and over time, humans learned to trust brass and gears over feathers and combs. Yet, for all the sophistication of clocks, there remains something quietly charming about the era when roosters held sway. They were small, stubborn, and unpredictable, shaping communities through instinct rather than design. They inspired law, poetry, ritual, and dispute. They were the first alarm clocks, the first municipal regulators, and sometimes the first actors in early European civil law. In the end, the story of roosters and mechanical clocks is a story about human ingenuity, pride, and the persistent attempt to control the natural world. It reminds us that even the simplest creatures, a crowing bird at dawn, can influence politics, law, and culture for centuries. As we prepare to close this sleepy, feathered chapter of history, consider the enduring resonance, early mornings, disrupted sleep, civic pride, and the subtle interplay between humans and the world around them. For centuries, roosters were more than birds. They were arbiters, agitators, and unwitting historians, shaping the rhythms of life long before clocks claimed dominion over time itself. Chapter 20. Reflections on Dawn, Roosters, Ritual, and Human Obsession. As we drift toward the end of this long, feathered journey, it's worth pausing to consider what these centuries of crowing, arguing, and regulating tell us about humans, history, and, oddly enough, roosters. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, roosters were far more than noisy birds. They were timekeepers, moral arbiters, legal actors, poetic muses, symbols of civic pride, and occasionally the protagonists of riots and disputes. In village squares, city streets, and royal courts alike, the early morning crow carried weight, meaning, and consequence. What strikes a modern reader, or listener, is the consistency of human reaction across centuries and borders. In France, people sued roosters. In Flanders, they wrote poems about them. In Italy, they competed to see whose rooster could crow best. In Germany and the Netherlands, they regulated, licensed, fined, and meticulously recorded every feathered offense. And all the while, the birds continued to crow at dawn, utterly indifferent to law, poetry, or civic pride. This tells us something quietly profound about human nature. We have long sought to control, measure, and systematize the world around us, even the natural world's most small and stubborn elements. Roosters, in all their chaotic predictability, forced humans to negotiate, codify, and ritualize. They were, in a sense, tiny teachers of order, patience, and occasional humility. It is also worth noting the gentle humor in all of this. For centuries, people invested serious energy into complaints, legal codes, guilds, fines, and festivals, all revolving around the same recurring sound, cock-a-doodle-doo. The absurdity was never lost on chroniclers, who often sprinkled commentary in their records, noting that human pride was far more sensitive to crowing than the birds themselves could ever understand. And there's a certain poetry in that. Humans, with all their sophistication and hierarchy, were ultimately at the mercy of nature's simplest rhythms. The crow of a rooster, the rise of the sun, the stubborn persistence of instinct. These small forces shaped laws, inspired literature, and stirred civic disputes. In a sense, roosters were early civil servants, teaching order, timing, and consequence without ever realizing it. As mechanical clocks took over, roosters' influence waned, but their legacy endured. Laws, rituals, and literary references persisted. Towers continued to ring bells at dawn, poems continued to celebrate vigilance, and festivals still honored these small but mighty creatures. And even today, in quiet rural mornings, a crow reminds us that humans are never entirely in control, that nature, with its simple insistence, always has the first word. So, as you settle into your evening, dim the lights, and let your thoughts drift with the rhythm of history. Imagine villages roused by rooster cries, magistrates scribbling ordinances, poets composing verses, and courts adjudicating feathery offenses. Imagine the stubborn persistence of a bird entirely unconcerned with human pride. And imagine, for a moment, the gentle continuity of life, where even the smallest creature leaves an imprint across centuries, echoing through law, ritual, and the quiet fascination of those who watch the dawn. Sleep now, if you can, and remember that history, like a rooster, waits for no one. And yet, somehow, it also endures, gently crowing in the margins of our imagination, shaping our mornings long after the laws, guilds, and councils have faded to dust.